Chancellor will be aware of serious concerns regarding welfare reform, and my constituent told me last week, "I'm terrified of what will happen to me if I can't work. I'm already having thoughts of suicide at the prospect of these changes and what they mean for disabled people." Today's impact assessment shows 250,000 increase in relative poverty, 50,000 increase in children living in relative poverty. What will the Chancellor do to stop this from happening?
Chancellor. The UK is the 6th richest country in the world, yet over 1 in 3 children and 25% of adults live in poverty. Since Labour came into power, 25,000 more children have been pushed into poverty due to the 2-child benefit cap. And now, according to the government's own impact assessment, over 250,000 people will be pushed into poverty as a result of these cuts, including 50,000 children. So I asked the Chancellor, who earns over £150,000 annually, has accepted £7,500 worth of free clothing, and recently took freebie tickets to see Sabrina Carpenter. Does she think austerity 2.0 is the change people really voted for?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Chancellor knows that our economy has been driven to the edge over the last 15 years, with ordinary people forced to bear the burden while a small minority have amassed extreme wealth. This is something she could change, and her own backbenchers are lining up to argue for a wealth tax. So why won't she do the fair and right thing?
I understand that this government has inherited a huge financial mess from the party opposite, caused by over a decade of austerity. But what is the justification for cutting disability benefits, especially when a third of disabled people are already in poverty, instead of choosing to tax the growing wealth of the super rich? For example, a 2% tax on assets over 10 million, which could raise 24 billion a year.
1.14 in the OBR report outlines that the planned cuts to disability benefits will reduce personal independent payments for 800,000 claimants and cut health-related universal credit for 3 million families. Isn't it time we ask those with the broadest shoulders to carry the heaviest burden rather than the poorest in our society?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There are 4.3 million children living in poverty in our society. There are 1.2 million people in receipt of PIP who are about to lose it following her statement last week. She's put a huge amount of money into defence. Could she not think for a moment of reversing the decision last week to take £5 billion out of the welfare budget?
It is estimated that in under 5 years there will be over 3 million families in receipt of disability benefits who will financially lose as a result of today's announcement, with an average loss of £1,720 per year compared to inflation. Is the Chancellor comfortable knowing that she has brought despair and horror to disabled people and their families?
My honourable friend, the member for St Albans, gave examples of alternative taxes to Labour's national insurance increases, asking that big banks, social media giants and online gambling companies to pay their fair share of tax. Can the Chancellor confirm she has heard these Liberal Democrat alternatives and explain why she isn't listening to these fair and sensible proposals?
Speaker, fiscal responsibility, unlike with the last administration, ensures that people are paying less and it keeps the cost of living down. However, as a Labour Party, we've got an additional responsibility around having social responsibility. So can we look at those DWP changes again? Of course, protecting the most vulnerable, but it's those people just above that band which are set to lose, and we're really worried about those.
Making cuts instead of taxing wealth is a political choice, and taking away the personal independence payments from so many disabled people is an especially cruel choice. A disabled person who can't cut up their own food without assistance, and can't go to the toilet without assistance, and can't wash themselves without assistance will lose their personal independence payment. So hasn't the government on this taking the easy option of cutting support for disabled people, rather than the braver option, which would be to tax the wealthiest through a wealth tax?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Chancellor tells us the world has changed, and if that's true to allow her to stick the boot into disabled people, it must also be true then to allow her to review her income tax rates, perhaps commensurate with those existing in Scotland, which has saw the Scottish economy grow in January by 0.3%, while the UK contracted by 0.1%. She could also choose to revise the government's position on reaccessing the single market in the European Union, which would allow a 30 billion recurring return with no compensation required, or a 1% tax on assets over 10 million. A wealth tax, as one of our backbenchers has just highlighted, 40 billion recurring every year with no need for compensation. If she's got the disabled, the WASPy women, pensioners and hospices in her crosshairs, why can she not tap up multimillionaires for a few quid?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Today and last week, the Chancellor rushed through severe cuts to the benefit system that will hit some of the most vulnerable in our society. Whilst we should have considered benefit reform, this is ill-conceived. Can the Chancellor explain to the Chamber why she is choosing to balance the books of the nation on some of the most vulnerable, on the backs of some of the most vulnerable of those in our society?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's absolutely right that the party opposite devastated our communities and left us with billions of pounds of debt. But it is not right that disabled people and the most vulnerable in our society should pay for that. Thousands of my constituents continue to be fearful about the announced welfare cuts. Disability organisations have warned that hundreds of thousands will be pushed into poverty. So I say to the Chancellor, we must make the right political choice, protect the most vulnerable in society and introduce a wealth tax so that multimillionaires and billionaires can pay their fair share.
Wales has a higher percentage of disabled people and a large public sector workforce compared to the UK, and so we'll hit hardest by these cruel cuts. All this damaged by self-imposed fiscal rules. There have been 5 major changes to fiscal rules since 1997. Will the Chancellor now change them so she doesn't impose further austerity?